18. Before we read today's passage, just to get you caught up with the context in which today's story takes place, today's story takes place after God frees the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, and they go to Mount Sinai, and God gives them the Ten Commandments. And Moses is on Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments. And as Moses is on the mountain speaking with God, the Israelites, below the mountain, they make a golden calf. And if you remember, Moses comes down and he sees the sin that the people of Israel had committed in making an image of God for themselves to worship. And then chapter 33 is where the story picks up. So Exodus chapter 33, verses 1 to 17, this is the word of God. The Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Say to the people of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do with you." Therefore the people of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments from Mount Horeb onward. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp. And he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up, and each would stand at his tent door and watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, 'Bring up this people,' but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, 'I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight.' Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people." And he said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? And the Lord said to Moses, this very thing that you have spoken, I will do. For you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. So the one question that we want to answer, I think, from Exodus chapter 33 is, what is the Christian distinctive? What makes a Christian distinct from every other person in the world? And I think that answer is found in Exodus 33. And also another way to kind of ask that question is, again, when you pray for yourself, when you pray for others in your life, whether it be your family or friends who are in need, how do you pray? Just kind of think to yourself, think about your most recent prayer, whether it be for yourself or for somebody in your life, somebody that is in need, right? How do you pray for them? And we'll get back to that towards the end of the sermon. One of the first things, when you read the Bible, especially when you read the Old Testament and you read about the people of Israel, whether you read about when you're reading the New Testament, you're reading about the disciples or the Pharisees, I think it's important that you don't judge too harshly the Israelites, the people that we read about. Because I think it's easy to read stories about people. It's easy to read stories like today in Exodus 33, to read stories about the Israelites and to stand in judgment on them and to say, wow, they're so bad. When the point of the story is the Bible is like a mirror for us, and we're like them. We're a lot more like the people of Israel in the Old Testament, the disciples, and maybe even the Pharisees in the New Testament. And so instead of standing in judgment on the people that we read about in the Bible, I think it's important that we're able to see ourselves in the people of the Bible. I think it's important that we're able to use the Bible as a mirror, and that we're able to see that we really are more similar, maybe than we would like to think. We're very similar to the people in the Bible. And so the first thing, one thing that you can learn how to pray from this passage, from this story, is God calls the Israelites a stiff-necked people. And I think a good response to this story would be to say to God, it's true, God, I'm stiff-necked. God, that's what I am, and God, that's who I am. God, I'm a sinner. God, forgive me for my stiff-neckedness. So I think it's important that you're able to see yourself and your sinfulness in the Bible, but also you see that God is angered. Right? You see that God is angered by sin. And this is important. God is angered by sin. And you see the consequence of sin. Right? The consequence of sin is that God says, my presence will not go with you. Right? And this isn't surprising, but it's important that you remember that is the consequence of sin. It is the absence of God's presence. And so even if you go back to Genesis in the Garden of Eden, right, when Adam and Eve, after they sin, their punishment is they are told that they need to leave the garden, right? But leaving the garden isn't really the punishment, right? The punishment is that they're separated from the presence of God, right? The Garden of Eden is where God lives. That's where, God walks. And so because of their sin, right, they no longer had God's presence. And so even, and again, this isn't surprising because what Jesus wins for us, right? What Jesus wins for us, when Jesus dies on the cross for our sin, and when he rises victoriously from the dead, what does he win for us? Or what does he gain for us? What he gives to us is God's presence, right? And so because of sin, what we lose is we lose God's presence. And what Jesus earns back or wins back for us is God's presence. But what I find very interesting about this passage is how it starts. Because chapter 33 of Exodus, in the first 2 verses, the first 2.5 verses, it starts off very positive. And if you did not know the context of this story, you would think that God is very happy with the Israelites. You would think that God is very pleased with the Israelites. Because God tells them that I'll give you everything. I'll give you everything I promised you. I'll give you everything you want. But remember, the context of the story is God is angry with the Israelites. He's angry with the Israelites because of their sin. And this is what he says. He says, depart. And you realize what he says now. He's not saying so much depart from a place, but he's really saying depart from me. Right? What God is saying to the Israelites is not so much depart from this mountain, Mount Sinai, but he's saying depart from me. But then it sounds very positive. Go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey. That sounds great. That sounds spectacular. And even inside, what I'm saying to myself is yes, yes, yes. But it's the second half of verse 3. God says, but I will not go up among you. But I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. And what I found really interesting about this passage is God says, I'll give you everything. I'll give you everything I promised you. Right? Because God is the God of promise. If God makes a promise, he keeps that promise. And he promised the Israelites this great land. So he says, I'll give you everything I promised you. And I'll give you everything you want. But I'm not going to go with you. And I found myself asking myself, would I take that deal? Would I be okay with that deal? God will give me everything I want. He'll give me anything and everything that I want. But he won't go with me. And I ask myself that question because I wonder how people inside the church and even outside the church, I wonder how people would answer that question. The past couple of weeks, I've been preaching through Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, there's a story of Jesus going to a dinner at the ruler of a house of the Pharisees. And Luke chapter 15 is right after that. In Luke chapter 15, you find the well-known parables, the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And so, as we were going through Luke chapter 14, I referenced the parable of the lost son a lot. I like the parable a lot. And I've said that I think a better title for the parable is a parable of the 2 lost sons, or the parable of the prodigal God. But it's traditionally known as the parable of the prodigal son. In today's story, it's similar to the parable. I think the parable is really good, and read it for yourself. I think the reason the parable is so good is I think it's so relevant to Christians today. I think it's very relevant to the church today. And I'm not saying it hasn't been relevant before, but I just think it's so relevant to the church today. So, but that parable, the parable of the 2 lost sons, or the parable of the prodigal God, it's similar to Exodus 33. Because in Exodus 33, God says, I'll give you everything you want. I'll give you all my stuff, but I'm not going to give you myself. Right? And if you remember the parable of the 2 lost sons, there are 2 sons. And again, the younger son is the more famous of the two sons, but both are lost. They're equally lost. Both don't love the father. Both want the father's things. But they have different ways at getting the father's things. The younger son, he gets the father's things by breaking all the rules, right? But the older son, he gets the father's things, or he tries to get the father's things by keeping all the rules. And again, it's more obvious that the younger son is lost. But the older son, it's not as obvious, but he's just as lost, if not even more lost. And I say that he may be even more lost because at the end of the story, at the end of the parable, the younger son is no longer lost. He's found, right? But the older son, he's still lost. And there's this question mark as to whether he will be found or not. Keeping the rules. It seems so good, right? And so many people think that that's what the Christian faith is about. But the problem with keeping the rules is, keeping the rules can be a way of getting the Father's stuff. It can be a way of getting God's stuff. Saying, God, I deserve it. God, you owe me. I've worked for you. I can't go into a lot of detail, but I do want to tangent just really quickly because there's a few things that I saw in this parable this week as I was thinking about it that I've never seen before. So we all know that the younger son shamed his father, correct? When he took his share of the inheritance and left and squandered it, he brought shame upon his father. But it's not as obvious, but the older son also brings shame to his father. Remember the story? How do you think, just think about it, how does the older son bring shame to his father? The older son brings shame to his father by refusing to go to the party. His father is celebrating the return of his younger son. And he openly rebels. The older son openly shows defiance and rebels in front of all the guests and refuses to go into the party. So he brings just, again, it's not as obvious, but the younger son brings shame to the father, and the older son brings shame to the father. Well, the father goes out and chases after the younger son. We all know this is a great part of the story, right? The father's probably been looking for him and waiting for his younger son to return. He runs off, and he sees his younger son, and goes to get him. And in doing so, probably protects him. But the father also chases after the older son. When the older son refuses to go into the party, what does the father do? He has to go after him, right? He has to go after him. He chases after him, and he goes to the older son. So there's a quote. So there's this book, and it's a great book. It's called The Prodigal God by Tim Keller. It's very short, and there's big print. Big print. You can probably see the print here. It's a great book about this parable. And if any of you want to borrow the book, you're welcome to. Just return it to me, please. But there's a quote in this book that I really like. But I don't like it because this is the quote, but there's no answer in the book. Like, I want the answer. Like, I just like the answer. And so this is the quote. The gospel of Jesus is not religion or irreligion. So religion is the older brother, and irreligion is the younger brother, right? Religion is keeping the rules. Irreligion is breaking the rules. So the gospel of Jesus is not religion or irreligion, morality or immorality, moralism or relativism, conservatism or liberalism. Nor is it something halfway along the spectrum between two poles. It is something else altogether. And I love that quote. I think it's a great quote. But my next question is, what is it? And he never gives a sentence. He never says, well, this is the gospel. And so this is what I saw for the first time this week. I always thought there were three main characters in the parable of the two lost sons. The father, the older son, and the younger son. Right? I don't think that's right. I actually think there's four main characters. So I think the main characters are the father, the older son, the younger son before he was forgiven, and the younger son after he was forgiven. Because even the Apostle Paul says, if you are in Christ, you are a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. The younger son, after he was forgiven, I don't believe he was the same person he was before. There's no way. There's no way that you could be loved and forgiven like that and be the same person you were before. I don't think so, at least, because that was me. That was me. I think there was the younger son before he was forgiven, and I think there was a younger son after he was forgiven. And what is the gospel of Jesus? The gospel of Jesus is not being the older son or the younger son before he was forgiven. The gospel of Jesus is the younger son after he was forgiven. The gospel of Jesus is being won by the love of Jesus. Did the younger son, just imagine, did that younger son stay at home? And did that younger son obey his father from that point on? I think the answer is yes. But he didn't do it because he had to. I think he did it because he wanted to. Because he'd been won over by the Father's love. See, that's the thing. At the beginning of the parable, the older son and the younger son, they didn't want the father. They didn't love the father. You know, when the younger son says, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance," what he's saying is, "Dad, I wish you were dead. Just die. Because if you died, I'd get your stuff at least. I don't want you. I just want your stuff." And that's kind of what God is saying today in Exodus 33. I'll give you the stuff. I'll give you all my stuff. But I'm not going to give you myself. I don't know. What would you say to that? Earlier this summer, our youth group went on a summer retreat. Went to our denominational youth conference, and they were doing icebreakers. And they got the kids like in a big circle, and you're supposed to answer these questions. And so take one step forward if it's A, one step back if it's B. Like Coke, Pepsi, take one step forward, back. And, it's just a fun game. But it started getting more deep, like towards the end. And towards the end, it was, if you could have unlimited money, take one step forward. And if you could have unlimited time, take one step back. So if you could have unlimited money, take one step forward. But if you could have unlimited time, take one step back. And so these are youth group students, right? And so you can guess, the majority of them took one step forward. They wanted unlimited money. And I sat there, I'm like, fools. Because as you get older, you realize that your limiting resource is not money, it's time. If I give you time, if you give me your time, you're giving me what's most precious to you. Because you could have all the money in the world, but if you don't have time, you can't do anything with it. It's time, right? And so this is the thing, when you're younger, you have lots of time, but no money, right? But when you're older, you have, money, but no time, right? And then there's that in-between stage of life. If you ever find someone who has both, it's dangerous, right? So if you want to do something really bad, you need both time and money. Now, you can do bad stuff with just money and just time, but if you want to do them really bad, I think you need both time and money. And so I always look for people who have both time and money. And if you have both time and money, you got to be careful. But one of the great times of life is when you first get married before you have kids, right? Because for a lot of people, when you're newlywed, you have time and you may have some money. And so I remember when we first got married, good advice people told us is just go on vacation as much, travel as much as you can. And, we didn't have that much money, and we didn't really understand what people were saying, but by then I had kind of believed that's wisdom. I just need to listen to what older people are telling me. And so we got the chance, we traveled, and we didn't have a lot of money, but we traveled a lot. And now we have 4 kids, and we travel in our minivan, but it's a lot harder to travel. You just don't have that time. You don't have that time. So time and money. But again, I think it's similar to this question. If God said to you, I'll give you everything you want. I'll give you everything you want. But I'm not going to go with you. Again, what we lost because of sin was the presence of God, right? And what Jesus won back for us was the presence of God. The distinctive of the Christian is the presence of God. What makes a Christian different than the non-Christian? It's not the material stuff. It's not the material blessing. It's the presence of God. Even I was talking to Jan about this. My wife, we were spending some time with friends, sports friends, and, they were talking about, houses and cars. And you listen to it, it's easy to get caught up in it. And it's easy to kind of compare your life with it and be impressed. It's really easy to be impressed by, wow, they have so much stuff. They have so much nice stuff, right? We were driving home, and we're like, oh, man, it's so easy for me to compare. And I read this story, and I was like, wow, they don't have anything. What I have is so much better than what everyone else has. They've got stuff, but I've got God. Right? They've got all the stuff, but what I have, they don't have. And I've got God. And that's not comparable. There's no comparison. The story starts off, I got to end, but the story starts off with Moses saying, God, who are you going to send with me? God, you told me to lead these people. Who are you going to send with me? Right? And God says, well, I'll go with you. But that's not good enough for Moses. Because if it was, this story would end halfway. Because halfway through today's passage, Moses convinced God. God says, I'll go with you. But the reason the story continues is because that wasn't enough for Moses. For Moses, he said, but these are your people. See, these aren't my people. These are your people. And your people need you. And the difference between God's answer in the middle and the end is God doesn't simply say that I'll go with you, Moses. God says, I will go with you, my people. When I pray for myself, when I pray for our church, this is not my church. This is not my church. This is God's church. And I have the privilege to serve God's church. You are God's people. And when I pray for this church, I say this to God. God, these are your people. God, they bear your name. God, for your name's sake, God, would you help us to live lives of faith? God, for your name's sake, God, they're your people. They're not my people. They're your people. And so I'm going to end by answering the question that I asked at the beginning. When you pray for yourself, when you pray for others, how do you pray? There's one prayer that you should pray. It's for God's presence. It's for God's presence. That's what you should desire. For yourself, for your family, for your friends. Because where God's presence is, there His power is also. But what makes a Christian distinct, right, from all the peoples in the world is that we are the people of God, which means that we are the people who God is present with. That we would desire God and His presence more in our lives. Would you pray with me as we close today? God, we do confess that we are sinful. We confess that we are hard-hearted and stiff-necked. Confess that we are stubborn. Oh God, we confess that we are in need